Hello and welcome to another edition of the Florida Writer Podcast, a discussion about writing and other things. I am your host, Allison Nissen. Today, I am lucky enough to have Al Pessin with me. Al, could you give me a 60-second elevator pitch about who you are and what you write?
Hi, Allison. It's great to be with you. And who I am is a former journalist. I live in Delray Beach, Florida, and I've written my first novel. It's called Sandblast. It's the story of an American soldier who goes into Afghanistan undercover, joins the Taliban in order to find the new global terrorist mastermind who has been terrorizing the United States and Western Europe for the last year or so. This soldier who goes undercover inside Afghanistan obviously must be an Afghan-American. He's a U.S. Army lieutenant. He speaks Pashto, the main Afghan language, and he is a Muslim. And so he, with some considerable effort, manages to blend in and attempt to accomplish his mission. His boss is a woman named Bridgette Davenport, who's an Army veteran, 2 combat tours behind her, West Point grad, in fact, and she now works at the Defense Intelligence Agency, and it's her job to keep his mission on track when political priorities change and the top brass and the president decide maybe they want to go in a different direction and leave Faraz high and dry in Afghanistan.
So you are a journalist with international experience. Did you spend time in Afghanistan?
I spent a little bit of time in Afghanistan and in Iraq as well. I covered the Pentagon for the Voice of America from 2005 until 2011. So I made many trips to the war zone during that period with the Secretary of Defense, at first Rumsfeld and later Bob Gates, and with various senior generals and admirals who were going on their sort of information gathering trips. So I did several short trips traveling with senior officials. I did not embed with the troops per se, but I met an awful lot of troops. I saw a lot of the country and heard the same high-level briefings that the admirals and generals and secretaries heard in terms of what was going on in the various areas and the claims they were making, the difficulties they were having. And then, since I was there for nearly 6 years at the Pentagon, I was able to see how that played out, which was not always the way people had said it would or thought it would.
Sounds like an amazing experience.
It was. It was really, it was the next to last assignment of my career, as it turns out, and it was really one of the highlights. I had covered the White House previously for about 1.5 years at the beginning of the Clinton administration. I'd been posted in New York. I covered the financial markets. I'd lived in Asia and in the Middle East, but working at the Pentagon and covering the global war on terrorism and the twin wars we were and still are to some extent fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, and really learning how that all works and who these people are who volunteer to defend us was really a sort of a transformative experience for me. And then when I moved on to London, which was my last assignment, and I found myself covering a lot of economics and diplomacy and Brexit and all that kind of stuff. And then all of a sudden, the Ukrainian revolution happens, and I'm in the middle of yet another public square sort of revolution. And then the Russians invade. So I was able to use that Pentagon and security and defense experience that I had to cover the last big story of my journalism career, which was the Russian invasion and troublemaking in eastern Ukraine.
I can only imagine that the wealth of information that you had at your fingertips to write this book, how long did it take you?
Well, from when I got the idea and thought about it was a good 10 or maybe 12 years ago, during that period that I was covering the Pentagon. And really, I should have written the book during all those very long flights from Washington to Baghdad and Kabul and other places that we went. But I didn't write it during those flights. And so when I retired about 4.5 years ago, I wanted to write that story that I'd thought up about how we could use our diversity against our enemies, specifically in Afghanistan or Iraq, and I chose Afghanistan for the first one. I had this idea during the hunt for Osama bin Laden, and so I thought having somebody sort of who could infiltrate into that world would help find Osama bin Laden. Of course, they found him anyway. And by the time I got around to writing the story, I had to change it up a little bit. But yes, all the experiences and understanding that I gained during those years, as well as during my years living in the Middle East and in South Asia, certainly were very useful in writing the book. I lived 4 years in Jerusalem, covering mostly the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but also side trips, reporting trips to Egypt and Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey and Cyprus. And then prior to that, I had spent about 6 months living in Pakistan as a fill-in reporter in our bureau there, and covering during that time the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, but covering it from the outside through interviews and freelance reporters inside Afghanistan who risked their lives to get the information and send it to us, as well as what the Western embassies were able to provide to us in the way of intelligence reports that had been declassified. So that was all of that experience in South Asia and the Middle East and the Pentagon and the White House, and just being a reporter and editor in Washington for many years. I couldn't have written a book without all that.
I am very impressed. I want to ask, do you speak multiple languages?
I do, not necessarily very well, so don't test me, Allison. But my French and Hebrew are pretty good. My Arabic is not as good. My Chinese, which I took for 2 years in college, is all but gone at this point. And that was my first sort of geographical area of experience. So I did 2 years of Chinese in college. My first overseas post was Hong Kong, and then Pakistan, and then up to Beijing. And I was actually kicked out of Beijing after the Tiananmen massacre in '89. So yeah, I speak a little bit of 6 or 7 languages.
I bet you have about 40 different books you could be writing. With all the different experiences that you had, I mean, being kicked out of China like that would have been frightening and yet a little bit exhilarating at the same time.
Oh, absolutely. And I was scheduled to leave China within a year after I actually got kicked out. So it was jarring, and it was not what I wanted to happen, but it was pretty exciting. I got famous for 15 minutes. I was all over the American TV networks. This was a few days after the Tiananmen massacre, so all of the major networks still had big operations in Beijing that they had there for the democracy movement, and they covered the massacre and the aftermath. And by the time you got to the 5th or 6th day afterward, they were looking for a new angle on the story. And all of a sudden, a guy from the Associated Press and I got kicked out. And so we were the story of the day, in fact, for a couple of days. And so I was interviewed on all the networks and by the newspapers. I had a press conference in my office. I was even interviewed in my poor French by Vatican Radio. So it was kind of, if you have to go, it was kind of a fun way to go, and had the added benefit they didn't throw me in prison. They just kicked me out.
You're right. That is definitely an added benefit.
It was.
You have 2 books that you have Sandblast, but then there's another one that you're working on. Is that what I understand? Right.
So the sequel to Sandblast is called Blowback. The manuscript is finished and has been submitted to my publisher, and I'm eagerly awaiting their feedback any day now. And what's on my screen right now is the synopsis for the 3rd book, which doesn't have a title yet. And within the next week or so, I hope to finish plotting out that book. And once they've had a chance to read Blowback, then I'll be ready to send them the synopsis for the 3rd book so I can get going on that, because I have a deadline for book 3, which is January 15th, which sounds like it's far away, but as you know, and as all writers know, even a long deadline is still a deadline if you have to put out 100,000 words.
I love the titles, by the way. Blowback and Sandblast, those are great. So what do you think the title for book 3 might be?
Well, I probably shouldn't speculate, but I know that the publisher will want there to be some sort of action in the title, like a blast or like blowback or something like that. So don't be surprised if there isn't some sort of explosive element, and probably again a 1-word title. So I'll have to get back to you on that.
You've also written plays. Now, I've got to tell you that they are very different skill sets. Writing novels
Mhm.
and writing plays are not the same thing.
No, they're not. And I've only written one play. And I did that for a couple of reasons. First of all, I had finished Sandblast. I got an agent fairly quickly. We worked together for a year or a little more. Then I fired her because she did not fulfill promises that she made to me. And then I started querying again. And as you know, when you're querying, there's just a lot of waiting involved. Even if you send out queries almost every day, there's just a lot of waiting involved. And I didn't want to start another book. I'd worked on Sandblast for so long, I just couldn't face another 80 or 100,000 words. So I wanted to write something shorter. And I got this idea because besides FWA, I'm a member of MWA, Mystery Writers of America. We have a very active chapter down here in South Florida. We do the Sleuth Fest conference in March. And so I've met a lot of wonderful mystery writers, but I'm not particularly a mystery fan. So I thought maybe I'd write a murder mystery spoof in honor of all my MWA friends. And I didn't think I could sustain something funny for the length of a full novel. So then it would be like a novella, but I'm not sure there's really much of a market for novellas. And one way or another, walking my dog one night, I got the idea to try to write it as a play. And I was so ignorant of how to write a play that I had to look up online what the proper page format was for writing a play. And then I just sat down and I wrote it. We had a group down here actually in Boca Raton, which unfortunately disbanded recently, but it was called the Play Group. And they used to have monthly workshops where playwrights would bring pages and actors would come and do cold table readings of the pages, and then everybody would critique the work. And it was really wonderful workshops. So I started bringing pages there, and they loved it. And one of the board members of the Play Group said, when you finish it, submit it to us and maybe we'll produce it. And they did in November. And that actually turned out to be their last production. But we played 4 sold out shows at the Willow Theater in Boca Raton, and people seemed to love it. Very
fun. I am kind of jealous.
I should say that it's called Murder at the Butcher's, and it's a farce. And I'm kind of a frustrated comedian. Not that I ever really made an effort to have a comedy career, but it was sort of a fantasy of mine to either be a stand-up comic or to be a writer for the Tonight Show or something like that. So this was finally my opportunity to put down on paper all the stupid jokes that I could come up with.
Well, that's a great place to put them. I know I always thought I'd like to be an ad writer for ESPN back in its heyday when they had, they still have some funny ads, but they used to have some really great ones. When they first started, I just loved watching it just for the advertising.
Yeah, it's fun to try to write comedy. Yeah, it's not easy, but it's fun.
Yeah, right. I always think I'm funny, and then I realize I'm not, but I try. Tell me, what are some of the things aspiring writers should do to give themselves the best chance for success?
Well, I do a seminar, which I've done twice at the Writers Colony here in Delray Beach, which is also where I took some writing classes and joined my first critique group. But I've done this seminar there twice, and I'm doing it at Sleuth Fest in March about how to go from being a writer to being an author, how to get that manuscript polished and published. And the main 4 words that I tell people in the seminar, I say, if you don't remember anything from the seminar except these 4 words, these are the words: take a professional approach. And that applies especially if you're not actually a professional. So what I mean by that is learn the principles of fiction writing and practice them and take classes and go to critique groups and read everything you can read online and absorb all of the webinars and podcasts and whatever. Make it your own in the end, but at least know the basics. And then be smart about your querying. And a lot of my seminar is about that sort of process of the query letter and how to choose the agents that you query and how not to get frustrated. Don't send people back nasty notes, and don't waste their time with superfluous material or fancy fonts and all of that. It's pretty basic. And then one other thing, when you do start shopping around your manuscript or reading excerpts to critique groups, or sending your manuscript to beta readers, which is very important, not just your family members, but people who know something about writing or about the subject you're writing about. Take and adapt criticism. Those are 4 more important words. And what I mean by that is you don't have to make exactly the change that somebody suggests, but think about why they didn't like the way you wrote it, especially if more than one person points to the same thing. And then if you don't like the suggestions that are being made, find some sort of middle road. And if we have another few seconds, I'll tell you my own personal favorite revision story.
Sure.
2 characters in my book. Bridgette Davenport is the West Point grad Defense Intelligence Agency official I mentioned earlier. She's 38 years old. She is single. She has a boyfriend whose name is Will Jackson. He's a Navy SEAL. He's an officer. He's 34 years old, very accomplished guy in his own right. They've been going out for about 3 months, and he's about to be deployed to Afghanistan. I wanted him to have a pet name for Bridgette, but I didn't want it to be too sort of soapy, sticky, because it doesn't match their personalities or their ages or their jobs. So I thought about it for a while, and I settled on Kiddo. So he calls her Kiddo. Well, Allison, I don't know how you feel about that, but every woman in my life hated it. My writing teacher, my wife, all the members of my critique group, who are all women except me, they all hated it, and they wanted me to change it. So did I change it? I did not change it, but I made Bridgette hate it too. And that provided me with a subject of banter between the 2 characters that goes on through pretty much the whole book and illuminates their relationship and helps illuminate the evolution of their relationship over the course of the book. And then they resolve the issue in the last chapter. So it really was a useful criticism, even though I didn't do what all the people were demanding that I do.
But it added an element of realism.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And really one of the most difficult things for me about writing these books is writing Bridgette and the other women as well, but especially Bridgette, because she's a main character. And, you know, I have no idea what women are thinking or feeling at any moment for any woman. So I really take a lot of input from my critique group and from my wife and my beta readers on, you know, what would Bridgette be thinking? What would she be doing? How would she react in various situations? So it's really very useful for me. But in that situation with the word kiddo, I brought my sort of writer skills to bear, and I said, well, that's useful. If they hate it, then maybe if she hates it, then I can work with that. And it also meant I didn't have to think up another word to use.
I like it. I think that sounds fantastic. Well, Al, how could people get in touch with you?
My website is alpessin.com, ALPESSIN.com. You can sign up for my mailing list. You can send me an email through the website. You can see pictures of me in various silly-looking combat outfits out in Afghanistan and Iraq. You can see pictures of my dog and learn more about Sandblast and Blowback, and soon about book 3 once we get that squared away. So alpessin.com is the way to reach me.
Are you ready now to switch to our rapid fire questions?
Oh boy. Okay. Is this going to be like, is there math involved?
No.
Never ask a journalist to do math.
All right. I'm going to keep that in mind. All right, Al, what was the last concert you saw?
Ooh, can I say I'm going to see James Taylor this summer?
Absolutely. That's going to be a fantastic show.
Yeah. Oh, and I saw a hits of the 60s and 70s at Florida Atlantic University with the real guy from Herman Sermons. a few weeks ago. That was pretty good too.
That sounds like a lot of fun. Do you like sticky notes?
I don't have a lot of use for sticky notes. They tend to unstick and curl up, and I try to go electronic and set reminders and stuff like that.
And what's your go-to breakfast food?
Cappuccino and a banana.
Cappuccino and a banana. That sounds good. Actually, it does sound good, but well, Al, thank you so much for stopping by.
Thank you, Allison. This was fun, and hope to see you in October at the conference, if not before.
I think that sounds like a great idea. We'll meet up at the conference. Al, once again, thank you for coming. This has been another edition of the Florida Writer Podcast. Allison out. Al Pessin is an award-winning journalist, author, and playwright. His new novel, Sandblast, will be published in spring 2020. The first of the Task Force Epsilon thrillers, Sandblast was a top 5 finisher of the Unpublished Book of the Year competition at the 2018 Royal Palm Literary Awards and a shortlist selection for the 2017 Bosque Fiction Prize. Al's play Murder at the Butcher's won the top award for scripts at the 2019 Royal Palm Literary Awards and played 4 sold-out premiere performances at the Willow Theater in Boca Raton, Florida. Judges called the play hilarious and exceptionally well plotted. Al is considered a master playwright with a rich level of creativity. He was a journalist for Voice of America for 39 years. Assignments include his corresponding posts in Hong Kong, Islamabad, Beijing, Jerusalem, and London. He currently lives in Delray Beach, Florida with his wife and their precocious Labrador, Rory. Contact Al through www.alpessin.com. For more information about the Florida Writers Association, visit us at floridawriters.net.